Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
Thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen, for Point of View. I don't think we're going to get any apologies from ABC. They've been silent, according to the Daily Signal today, on the mauling of Pence's Christian faith on The View. And I don't know if you heard about it, but ABC actually received 25,363 complaint phone calls after the co-host of The View, Joy Behar, said on air that the vice president's Christian faith is a mental illness. It doesn't look like we're going to get any apologies despite that many complaints over the mocking of Vice President Mike Pence's Christian faith. And this is what she said. She said, "It's one thing to talk to Jesus. It's another thing when Jesus talks to you. That's different. That's called mental illness." And, Mike Pence, he's a gentleman, but he wasn't going to let that one go because it pertained to not only him, but a lot of Christians. So he said, "When I heard that a program likened my Christianity to mental illness, I just couldn't be silenced." He said this in an interview with Fox News. "It's simply wrong for ABC to have a television program that expresses that kind of religious intolerance." And this is a tweet from the vice president. He said, "I do try and start every day reading the Bible. My wife and I try to have a prayer together before I leave the house every morning. But I do think I'm a very typical American. I think people of all different faith traditions cherish their faith in God." And it was very offensive for Joy Behar to make fun of it. It is a basic tenet of Christianity that God in three persons, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, speaks to believers. This coming out of the Daily Signal. Through the Bible, number one, through their prayer lives, and also just in our circumstances. And, so for her to mock it like this, I think it did warrant an apology from ABC, but we didn't get one. So that's something that you probably will wait a long time for and not see. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have an interesting program today. We're going to talk about parenting and education and sort of some of those related topics, things that are dear and near and dear to my heart. And, the question that we might ask with our first guest is, how do you handle no more kids in the home? She's written a couple of books about the empty nest. And, the second book that she has written that we are going to talk about it, and the author's name is Michele Howe, is called Preparing, Adjusting, and Loving the Empty Nest. So how do you prepare for it? How do you adjust to it? And how do you love it? Some people dread it. Other people can't wait. And a lot of us are somewhere in between, experiencing different emotions. So we'll talk about our emotions having to do when the kids leave the home, and also just ways to prepare them to leave the home. And also, how do you make your home a welcoming place for your adult children and without nagging them to visit you or not being able to wait until they leave? So we'll talk about empty nest during the first hour of the program. And then later in the program, we are going to talk about social emotional learning. And, over the years that I've been involved with Point of View, which has been a long time, since the 90s, we've talked about various educational trends, things that often the federal government tries to foist on schools and school districts and just the whole educational establishment from on high, from the federal government. Well, there's a new attempt now with the new, they're new, but they're also sometimes repackaged ideas that the left tries to foist on our educational system. And this new one is called social emotional learning. And it's kind of a fad, really. Let's hope it's a fad. It's supposed to shape the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors of the students so that they can excel in the academics, but it really places academics on the back seat, and teaching things more like empathy becomes more important. Should schools really be dabbling in this, and what are the dangers? And we're going to ask our guest, Stella Morabito. She's a senior contributor to The Federalist, among other things. So we'll talk with her. But back to the idea of the empty nest. And before I bring our guest on, I just want to give you a few stats related to that, because, you know, the empty nest is on one end of it, something parents have to deal with. But a lot of parents today are also dealing with something else, and that is 30-something young people still at home. And there are a lot of them, and the number is increasing. This is from the Pew Research Center, and it says that through both recession and recovery, so even now as we're recovering, we can't blame this all on the economy. The share of young adults living in their parents' homes continues to rise. And the Pew Research Center report says today's young adults are also more likely to be at home for an extended stay compared with previous generations of young adults who resided with their parents. And this takes census data to determine this. And these numbers, as of 2016, 15% of 25 to 35-year-old millennials were living in their parents' homes, and this is 5 percentage points higher than the share of Gen Xers who lived in their parents' homes in 2000, which is sort of a comparable time frame as far as ages go. About 10% lived with their parents then. This is nearly double the share of the silent generation who lived at home in 1964, and that was 8%. So it seems like as time goes on, more and more adult young people are staying home and living with their parents. There are a lot of reasons, but Pew says it doesn't appear that a lack of jobs is keeping millennials at home. As of the first quarter of 2016, when these data were collected, only 5.1% of older young adults were unemployed. And that's down from 10.1% in the first quarter of 2010. So things are getting much better for the employment of these young people. But for some reason, they're still staying with their parents. There's some insight when they look at the mobility information that provides some insight into the extent to which the nation's young adults are moving in and out of certain living arrangements. Millennials are moving significantly less often, whether they're living with their parents or not. And these long-term stays at home are an uptick from the past. So it's not necessarily all explained by people just waiting for that next opportunity and staying with mom and dad for a little while before that happens. It's becoming more and more of a permanent arrangement. And you may have noticed this in some of your friends. I've noticed it. Among young adults who move back in with their parents, says the Pew study. So they'd moved out, and now they're coming back. The median estimated length of time spent living with their parents was 3 years. It's a pretty long time, according to research based on credit report data. This is very interesting, and it's more prominent among less educated young adults. The more educated they are, the more likely they were to live out of the home. Millennials who had completed at least a bachelor's degree lived at home, compared with 7% of college-educated Gen Xers who lived at home in 2000. 20% of young adults with no more than a high school diploma lived in their parents' home in 2016. So that's a phenomenon. We will discuss that with our guests. I mean, how do you prepare your kids to move out? Do you have to start early, or do you have to give them some other incentives? So we'll have all of that, and we will welcome your phone calls today on Point of View, because I think this is a phenomenon that almost every family will experience. So we'd love to hear from you, and we'll do that right after these messages. Stay with us for more of Point of View. We'll be back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Yesterday I talked about a few pieces of legislation that might actually stem gun violence. There is another issue that also deserves attention. How many criminals and potential mass shooters are getting their guns through online gun sales? One report from a number of years ago suggested that this was a potential problem. That is why two members of Congress, Representative Elijah Cummings and Senator Elizabeth Warren, asked the GAO to investigate. In November, they completed their 2.5-year investigation. During the operation, undercover buyers revealed information during their transaction that indicated that they should not be allowed to purchase a firearm. That means they pretended to be felons or individuals with domestic violence or outstanding restraining orders or addicts or unlawful users of controlled substances or people who were dishonorably discharged from the military. Ultimately, there were 72 total purchase attempts that were made with these online vendors. How many of these purchases actually succeeded? The number would be 0. Most of the sellers, in 56 cases, refused to complete the transaction. In another 5, the cases were frozen. And in the remaining 11 cases, it seems that the sellers wanted to take their money without actually delivering the firearm. I might add that another part of the study looked into the dark web. Criminals and terrorists sometimes visit this dark place on the internet where content has been intentionally concealed and special computer software is needed to access it. In that case, the GAO did complete 2 transactions, and both are referred for further investigation. For years, we've been hearing stories about the dangerous wild, wild web. It turns out that it may not be as much of a problem when it comes to gun sales. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
It's a phenomenon in life that most of us have to experience at some point or another. Some people, as I said, embrace it. Other people can't stand it. And most people are somewhere in between, and we learn a lot when our children leave the nest. And I am Penna Dexter. I'm so glad to be hosting Point of View today. My guest joining me now is Michele Howe, and she is the author of 18 books. And she's also published over 2,500 articles and reviews on parenting, women's issues, and the topic that we're going to discuss today, the empty nest. Her first book is called Empty Nest, What's Next? And by popular demand, she wrote another book because there were so many topics to cover within this whole category of what do you do about the empty nest. For instance, as we discussed earlier, preparing for the empty nest, preparing your child during high school and earlier years, and also adjusting to it, and then loving being an empty nester. I'm an empty nester, and I'm loving it. But it did involve some pain. So we will discuss that. And Michele, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted.
Well, I'm delighted to have you. And, you know, it is a transition, and some people can't wait for it. But often you have emotions you don't expect, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, a lot of people will ask me, because my husband and I have 4 adult children, we have 4 grandchildren, and we have one daughter still living at home while she's finishing her degree, but pretty much our kids are gone. And I will tell you, from the time my first daughter left to where we're at now, each time was a significant adjustment period. I mean, some moms and dads are like surprised when their second or third child might move out. But when you sit around the dinner table and a person is absent, every single time that happens, there's a new dynamic. the family changes, the family unit when you're sitting together. And it's kind of startling to moms and dads. And there's a real grief period for some. Others, it takes longer to get through it. Some, breeze right on through and, they have no problem. But each family's unique. And I like to encourage moms and dads, don't, compare your experiences with other empty nesters, because your family is unique. Your response will be unique to your own unit.
Michele, before the break, we discussed something that I know that you're sort of front and center for you, and that is kind of the opposite end of the empty nest, and that is when adult children live at home into their 30s. And this piece is media release that I think you guys put out. There are more adult children living at home than are married. Nearly 1 in 3 18 to 34-year-olds are at home. I had that experience. They weren't in their 30s, but they were, after college coming home. My daughter, before her wedding, planned her wedding while she was living at home. And actually, it wasn't so long that I was ready to push them out yet, but I can see that in many parents' cases it is.
Well, even more startling is another statistic. I think that 85% of college graduates go back home before they launch. 85%. So that means only if your child has lived on his own or on her own at college away in a different state for 4, 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it is, they come home generally until they get that job. And, most kids stay home quite a while because we all know it takes longer and longer to get through the job process to find the right job in the right city in the right state. So I like to encourage moms and dads to think of it this way. There are good reasons for your adult children to live at home, and there are not so good reasons. And you have to evaluate that. If your adult child, even if they're in their 30s or early 40s, depending on their age, and they go through a financial crisis, let's say they go through an unwanted divorce, it's wonderful to offer your adult children and their children, your grandchildren, a safe haven for a time period. That's a beautiful way to be a parent that's, on the job, even in your older years. I think the caution is you have to outline how long will you be living with us. Or if you're an older, widow or widower, your whole life will be changed again when your adult child moves back in. Again, the dynamic is, it's always active and it's changing. So you have good reasons and you have poor reasons. And only each mom and dad can decide, when their child comes to them, do you mind if I come home for 6 months or a year, Mom? Dad, whatever, you have to talk it through. And for some families, a contract is essential. If you have an adult child who is very responsible and independent and respectful, and they get it when they move back into your house, that if they stay out to 2 a.m, they need to alert you because you're still a parent and are going to be wondering if they're alive or dead in a ditch somewhere.
Right, that never ends.
It never ends. And as you might have a kid who thinks, man, I just have a free space for the next year. No, that it doesn't fly. So you really have to go through and ask yourself, what is best for my adult child in the long haul, not just for the next few months.
Michele, let's take a call because we've already got folks calling in on this. This is Steve in Ohio listening in on WGGN. Steve, tell us your story.
Yes, I've been married for going on 39 years in April. I love my wife dearly, and she became disabled a few years back. And we had struggled through some things. I'd lost my job. And my parents, my mother passed away about 6 or 7 years ago. Well, my brother has actually been living at my parents' home for almost 15 years now, rent-free. And he is 60 years old. And wow. He makes probably close to $70,000 a year and had never paid rent. And even after Mom passed away, he just lived there. Basically, even for a month, we had learned he had lost his job for a while and still would dress like he was going into work, and he didn't have a job. But he didn't want to tell Mom and Dad that, and that was back a number of years ago. But the weird thing is when and my father had moved out of the home. It's a 3-bedroom home, so we had asked about moving in. That first they had told us no, because he said that there was an issue. My brother didn't want us to move in. So then finally, with the disability my wife is on, he said, yes, go ahead and move in. Well, shortly after we move in, he says, well, now I want you guys to start paying rent. And
so you guys paid rent, but the brother didn't. Well, Michele, there are a few problems there, aren't there?
I'd say there's more than a few problems. was like red flag after red flag. And I'm so sorry you're going through this. But the one word of encouragement is your circumstance is more common than you think. And I think this is why I think even as adults, and I talk about it in other books with aging parents, you know, there can always be the golden child who can really not treat the parents very well, but everything they do is just okay. And then the other siblings sit there and go, wow, I'm the one who cleans their house, takes them to appointments, you know, make sure they have meals, whatever. But going back to your situation, I don't know if you have any other siblings, but if you do, maybe a family meeting is like imperative, like now, right away, to actually talk about all these things and to make a list, you know, you and your wife, and even ask your brother and your parents to sit down and really talk through the struggles that you're having and then offer some solutions. You know what? And I don't know your family. Some families will go, wow, I never thought about that. And honestly, some people don't think. They don't think that there's a disparity there between you paying rent and your brother not paying rent. Other people know full well what they're doing. However, giving them the Christian benefit of the doubt, you want to, you know, overcome evil with good every time you can. And I would say be practical first, be prayerful, but you have to have a meeting. And if you can't solve it within your family, then you need somebody like a negotiator to come in and kind of work with the family. And I don't know if that, you know, some people do not want peace. Some people aren't reasonable. But you gotta move forward. Otherwise, you're going to be eaten up with bitterness and resentment, and your wife is probably going to get sicker, you know, through this whole stressful situation.
Steve, thank you for bringing that up and for your call. It is interesting, Michele. This is more common than Steve perhaps thinks it is, and I agree because I've seen some of that with different friends that I have. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd go to our website during the break, you can find out more about this book, Preparing, Adjusting, and Loving the Empty Nest, which is Michele Howe's latest book on the empty nest. And we're going to kind of delve into a little bit of it during the next 30 minutes, just to kind of give you an idea, first of all, what you can do with your kids to help them sort of have a healthy idea of leaving home. And then, I mean, I think this is fun to talk about, too, is how do you make your home welcoming and wonderful for them to come back to as visits, as parents with their kids? You know, what are some of the do's and don'ts of that? I think that's very interesting. And also just how do you deal with the changes that happen in your own life? Because a lot of times we don't like change, and God brings change into our lives, and we can either be bitter about it, we can nag other people about it, or we can embrace it. And I think, you know, the better way really is to try to find out what he would have you do to bless the people in your lives who have all moved on. Are you going to move on with them, or are you going to make it hard for them? And I think those are some of the things that this book discusses so much more. It's a very practical book, and I recommend it. But go to pointofview.net. You can see that. You can also find this Pew Research study that I discussed a little bit earlier, and also the piece about ABC not apologizing for insulting Mike Pence's faith. All of that at our website, pointofview.net. The donate button is also there, and we would ask that you'd make use of that. We'll be right back.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Penna Dexter.
We are taking your calls at 800-351-1212. What are your fears, your concerns, and even your successes having to do with being an empty nester? My guest is Michele Howe, and her latest book is Preparing, Adjusting, and Loving the Empty Nest. And Michele, you say in your book that you need to start the transition in high school, correct?
Yes, or even earlier. And I think one thing moms and dads can do, when they have those little bundles of joy in their arms, or little toddlers and their elementary age kids, is to start realizing that one day those children will be young adults walking out of their home forever. And some moms and dads can, look way ahead and say, yeah, that's part of the way God designed the family to be, and be okay with it. Others, not so much. But one of the best practical exercises I think both men and women can do as moms and dads is to start by giving your children small steps of independence and responsibility along the way. Age-appropriate, tasks, little chores, whatever it is. And as they grow, they take those little steps. They become, step by step, a little more independent from the family unit. But the important key part of this is as your kids grow and mature through the years, and they step away maybe to go to a day camp, and then a few years later maybe they go away to a sports camp all week. Whatever that step is for your child, the moms and dads incrementally take steps of independence away from their child. And I know some parents will be like, no. But yes. God designed the family for us to rear our children and to do that in such a way that they can be mature. They can use their giftedness, their talents that He's given them to become parts of society, dynamic change makers wherever God places them as adults. So we need to be prepping them all along the way, and also prepping our hearts with the real truth that they won't stay in our home forever.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to think about that when they're 6 months old. But Michele, I think the foundation that you lay in, and you talk about this a lot in the book, the foundation of faith that's laid in their life is probably the most important part of all of this preparation, isn't it?
Absolutely. They're going to catch and watch and listen and hear and absorb what you and your spouse do, or if you're a single parent, whatever. They're going to see you do life. They're going to watch you work through difficulties. They're going to watch you have moments of joy and happiness and celebration. And, they're just going to soak it in like little sponges, because we watch and absorb the people we live with, the people we spend the most time with. So, it's not like you have to be a perfect parent. None of us are perfect parents. I mean, my husband and I made so many mistakes along the way, but the best thing we ever did was to go back and ask forgiveness of our kids when we blew it, and say, I blew it. I was angry. I disciplined you in anger. I spoke in a way that was harsh and unkind. Please forgive me, and then you say to them, this is what I should have said in that moment. I was frustrated, but, that communication line, keeping it open, is so important. But, you can't really impart a faith walk to your child unless you have a faith walk that's dynamic, unless Christ is the most important thing in your life, unless, you're not making idols of money, career, socializing, whatever it is, fitness. You need to have Jesus front and center in your own life. And you know what? As you walk through your own life, the challenges, the uphill battles, whatever it is, and they see God's faithfulness to you, and they see you lean in hard when you need to, and even when your back is against the corner, and maybe you don't know how you're going to pay the next bill, or maybe you don't know how you're going to get through a health crisis, or you have a parent that's, got a terminal diagnosis, whatever it is in life. And, we'll all face those at different seasons. Is your kids are just going to watch you, and they're going to say, wow, mom's suffering, but she still is trusting in the Lord to see her through.
Michele, also one of the gifts, I think, speaking of money, that we can give, and in some ways, I look back when early in my marriage when my kids were little and we were financially very tight, and it was a blessing because it taught them that you don't get everything you want, that, you have to say no to yourselves. delayed gratification. Some of those lessons are some of the most valuable lessons you can have, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. We've been a one-income family for our entire married life, and have been married 34 years coming this December. My husband's a teacher and a coach, and God has always supplied our needs, and a lot of times He supplied our wants. But with 4 children, we had a budget, and I remember going to the grocery store trying to stick to the budget and saying, my kids would be clamoring for a treat, and their kind of treat was sugar cereal, because they'd get to pick out one box, and then we would, divvy it up. But they never went without. They never went without. Birthdays and holidays would come along, and, God would be generous, and they would get, their new clothes and whatever. But they had friends who were very wealthy. And I remember when they got into early adolescence, they started saying, wow, Mom, I would like this and this and this. And I'm like, we can afford this. We can't afford that. But I thought the best and the most important, character quality I wanted my kids to have was I wanted them to be grateful for what they had. I wanted them to be humble and grateful and really thankful, and looking around at people who had nothing in other countries. They have nothing, and we have so much. And I was trying to always impart that, and I'm thankful that my kids see that today, that they were like, Mom, I'm glad that you homeschooled us through our first 8 years, and then they went to a public school. But I will tell you, we sacrificed a lot. But on the other hand, I look back and I think that we had so much rich time with our children that we now, as older adults, would love to have more time with them now, but that season will never come again.
All right, Michele, you talk in your book about how some parents struggle with being empty nesters, and even sometimes the marriage struggles. You have to work on it. But Steve in Arkansas has a thought about that. Steve, thanks for calling in.
Well, you're welcome. Yes, I don't have so much a story to tell you as observation by my wife and my friends, married couple friends who have become empty nesters. And in our opinion, it seems that they gave up their relationship between the two spouses, between the two of them, making their children their end-all and be-all in their life.
That's common, isn't it, Michele?
Yeah, it's very common, yes.
We suggest things that they could do, go on a cruise together, go on a vacation together, and they just don't seem to be able to do it, because if the topic of conversation is about their children or their grandchildren, they don't have a topic of conversation. It's just something we've observed. Mm-hmm. And
Michele, can you give a couple suggestions about working on your marriage? I mean, I know that it's easy to get into that trap that Steve describes, that you're so busy with raising the children that sometimes you don't work on your marriage relationship. So if you have made that mistake, what do you do to get it back?
Well, and I think we have to be honest that probably all of us, if we've been married for any number of years, you could go for a few seasons and really be in sync with each other and going on those date nights and, really have a wonderful, rich well of communication between the two of you. And then you might go through a season or two that's really rough. I mean, my husband and I, like I said, almost married 34 years. We've had our ups and we've had our downs and we've had our in-betweens. But we've worked through it. And I think one thing is, if your friends have made the mistake, and it sounds like they have, of making their children their life, which is a mistake that many parents do make, you have to say, okay, now I have time, now I have energy. Do I really want to spend the next 30 years of my life with a person that I'm just a roommate with? No. But I think we have to go back and say, what can I do to repair it? First of all, they have to want to repair it. But secondly, you can challenge them biblically. I mean, you can gently, kindly say, you know what, this is what my wife and I have done. You know what, and life gets harder as you age, just because the body breaks down and people get sick. You lose your independence. I mean, I want my husband to be my main guy through all of that, to understand my emotional highs and lows. If I lose some of my, physical abilities, I mean, I want to be that for him. But I can't do that unless I'm investing right now. And when moms and dads, when their kids first leave, and my husband and I have done this, that's a great time to sit down over breakfast, in a restaurant or dinner, wherever you like to be with your spouse, and talk, and then let your spouse talk, and then in turn listen, because, they maybe have a lot of unresolved bitternesses and anger from failing each other, and let's face it, we're all going to fail each other, and I think Gary Thomas has tremendous resources out there for the marriage, about looking at the marriage relationship as far more than just making us happy, as Americans always want to be happy, but it is really a sacred relationship, and it's one that God uses to make us holy. So, you could get those resources for your friends, work through them with them.
Sounds like a fantastic idea. We will continue our conversation with Michele. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. On the 2017 National Day of Prayer, President Trump took a remarkable step in support of religious liberty. President Trump assembled religious leaders from a variety of faith traditions in the Rose Garden of the White House. In addition to making remarks about the National Day of Prayer, the president signed an executive order strengthening religious liberty. The executive action prioritizes religious liberty within the Trump administration, encouraging the HHS secretary to consider rules alleviating the religious conscience of those impacted by Obamacare, while ordering the IRS to decline enforcement of the Johnson Amendment and directing the Attorney General to issue guidance to all executive agencies on the law governing religious liberty. This executive order is one of the ways in which the president is fulfilling his constitutional obligation to ensure that the laws passed by the legislature be faithfully executed. Moreover, the executive order reins in those administrative agencies that have in recent years often ignored the laws governing religious liberty. As my boss, Kelly Shackelford, said after the president signed the order, our country was founded on the promise that its government would respect the religious liberty of its people. America's commitment to freedom, and especially religious freedom, should be our national priority. Much work remains in defense of religious liberty, but with this order, the president has set his administration on good footing. To learn how First Liberty is protecting the religious liberty of all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Give us a call, 800-351-1212, if you have a question for Michele Howe on being an empty nester. If you look inside this book and you see all the issues that are covered, it's called Preparing, Adjusting, and Loving the Empty Nest. There are 40 different issues having to do with being an empty nester that are in here. So it's a good resource. And Michele, one of the things that happens sometimes is it just doesn't turn out the way you expected when your children leave home. Sometimes their lives end up being somewhat of a train wreck. What if you end up raising your grandchildren? I mean, there's just many things that can happen. Your parenting doesn't end, does it?
No, it never ends. And I think one of the biggest myths out there is when people will say to young moms and dads, well, you only have them until they're 18. Then you can send them off. And then any parent who has a child over 18 realizes, well, that's a lie. You have them until you die, not until, they turn 18. But that's the way of life, and that's a good thing, because I know for my personal vantage point is my kids don't live at home, and my grandchildren, some of them live far away. So what can I do for them every day? I can pray for them, and I'd like to just challenge moms and dads. You know what? You may not talk to your kids or text your kids or email your kids or FaceTime your kids every day, but you can pray for them every single day of your life, and nobody's going to pray for your kids like you will. Mom or dad, you are the ones who have the most vested interest in their lives. You know them intimately. You know their strengths, their weaknesses. You know their struggles, their temptations. You know everything about them. So, get a journal out. Put a name at the top of each page for each one of your children, your grandchildren, your son and daughters-in-law, whomever is, in that family tree of yours, and get on your knees every day and ask the Lord, what should I be praying for? And date it and sign it and put verses in there and, really fortify your faith. I mean, one of the biggest messages that I've ever recalled that it hit me many years ago when I was a young mom is a teacher was saying, you know what, we're all bad rememberers. And the Israelites were bad rememberers. That's why they were told, remember what God has done for you. And you know what, if your child is in a point of crisis right now, I would encourage you to grab your Bible, look up some verses, about believing and faith and comfort and God's faithfulness, and write them down and just meditate on that. Meditate on the strength and the power and the sovereignty of God. Take your concerns before the Lord, and write down specifics. And then each day do the same over and over and over, knowing that you're placing your beloved child right in front of his throne.
I'm navigating this right now with having adult children and grandchildren. And you mentioned, Michele, that some of yours live far away. I just happen to have the situation where my 3 children all live in the same town with their spouses and their kids, so they're always around. And so I was surprised at the number of opportunities I have to do things for them. And I'm so grateful for it. And, I have to hold it loosely, I know. And you've talked about that in the book. I think that's one of the most important parts of your book, is talking about how you make your home a welcoming place, and yet you're not nagging your kids to come see you, but you're actually making yourself a person they would want to come and back and interact with as they're adults, and yet you're respecting their own autonomy. And there's a real balance there, isn't there?
Oh, there is, definitely. I mean, when my kids come in, I just want to, hug them. I'm so glad they're there. I try to make their favorite foods. We play games. We do whatever they enjoy while they're there. But, I don't offer advice unless I'm asked. And you know what? Sometimes as a mom, sometimes as a strong-willed mom that I am, I have to bite my tongue, when they say something or walk away. Now, we're not even talking about moral issues here. We're just talking about advice that, it's not my business anymore. It isn't my business how they spend their extra $500 that they got that was a surprise. I might say, save it. That'd be my inclination. But they might want to spend it. It's just moms and dads need to realize it's not that their kids are peers, but they are adults. They are adults, and treat them as such. And then there's another mistake that sometimes older parents, grandparents can make, is they really miss their adult children or grandchildren, and those kids make time to come home. And what's the first thing they hear? Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I haven't seen you in 6 months or whatever.
It's about time.
It's about time. That's the classic. It's about time. And what does that adult child or grandchild want to do? Turn right around and walk right back out. Because you know what? We're all busy. We're almost all working or in school or in service, responsibilities. We have families. Everybody's time is precious. And I don't ever want to make my kids feel like, wow, I haven't seen you in 2 weeks. You know what? If someone said that to me, my inclination is to want to leave too. It's like, oh, I really sacrificed to get here. I drove all this way to spend time with you, and now you're making me feel guilty. So if you are of the mind to ever do that, don't do it. Because I've watched so many older moms and dads, kind of innocently, kind of not, because they were trying to communicate their displeasure that they hadn't seen their adult child in a while or hadn't called in a while. Boy, and you know what? Those adult children just space it out longer, because they don't want to be shamed or made feel guilty because they have adult responsibilities now.
You know, and when kids move away, and I did this, my husband and I moved away, and we were never really around our parents. And, you know, at first I did sense that displeasure, but then they embraced it, and they came in and they just supported us. And I think parents do sometimes have to go through that transition. It's really hard, but, you know, you want your kids to be walking in God's will, and sometimes that is not what you think it should be, is it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my oldest daughter, and her and her husband have 3 grandchildren. She was my child who always said, Mom, we'll never move away, ever move away, because family's too important. Family support is too important.
Never say never.
A year and a half ago, my son-in-law got a job offer across the state, and, you know, a year and a half ago, they moved, and I will tell you, I grieved. I woke up the whole summer before they left in September almost depressed. And I'd wake up and I'd think, why is my heart so heavy? Oh, that's right. Nicole and her husband are leaving. They're leaving. They're really leaving. And you know what? It's taken us a year to adjust, because there's every first, just like there's a death. I mean, there was every first holiday, every first birthday. We were all navigating new terrain with, are we going to make the trip there? Are they going to come here? How are we going to work it out? You know, when you have 3 little boys, there's a whole lot of sickness going on too. And we're doing fine, but I just sat there and I thought, oh, Lord, you have such a sense of humor. Because this is my kid who said she'd never leave, while my other kid has always wanted to leave, and she's the one that's local now. But you have to acknowledge your emotions. And, you know, I encourage moms and dads, you're going to feel it. You're going to feel the weight of the loss and the sadness when your kids leave or when they move. Don't deny that, but just don't get stuck there. You can't get stuck there forever. And God doesn't want you to. He wants you to acknowledge it, because that is the right emotional response when someone we love leaves. We're sad. That's okay. But then what are you going to do with it in the coming weeks?
Michele, thank you for this great book. I think that a lot of people, no matter what their situation is with their adult children, could benefit from it. You really cover it all. So thanks for writing that second book on the empty nest, and also for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
It went too fast. And, you know, I just want to give one final thought that Michele put in her book, and that is God has things for us to do in various stages in our lives. And so, you know, if you don't need to spend as much time on your own children, He will bring others into your life to love and to help. And she says the children may not need us as much, but there will always be people in need in our lives, and we need to be open to that. So I think that's a great piece of wisdom here to end this up. And ladies and gentlemen, we're gonna have a little bit of an open line after the break, and then we're going to talk about sort of a scary little dangerous new trend in public education with Stella Morabito. So all of that is after this. Meanwhile, go to the website pointofview.net. You can find out more about Michele Howe and her book, and the donate button is there. We ask for your help. We'll be right back.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
We've been talking about the empty nest syndrome that most of us experience at some time or another if we're parents. And the guest is gone. The author of the book, Preparing, Adjusting, and Loving the Empty Nest, doesn't mean we cannot still continue to talk about it. And so I'd like to, we're still taking your calls at 800-351-1212. And, you know, I mentioned that I have learned to love being an empty nester just because it's just sort of a more, you have a little bit more control over your schedule, let's put it that way, when it's just you and your spouse in the home. And so I sort of enjoy that. And then they come in and visit. And so it's fun, but it is an adjustment. So we'd love to hear some of your experiences. Again, the number is 800-351-1212. Let's go to North Carolina. Andrea is waiting. Hi, Andrea. Thanks for calling.
Hey, thanks. Good to hear you. Good to hear you.
Good to hear you. Are you an empty nester?
I don't have any kids, but I'm always reaching out to kids on the street that are not saved, okay? That's where I'm at. But there's this social church. It's complicated, Penna. It really is. I've been a Christian as long as probably you have. You're a parent. I'm not. I'm not. But my heart's broken for those that are not saved. But as I go to this church, this is difficult because what you have the social church. You know, you've got the saved and the unsaved.
What's the social church? Explain that.
That, for me, means the name of the church. I don't need to say the name. They're all about Compassion International, you know.
Okay, the social gospel.
The global thing. You know, it's the global thing. You know, they got the coffee house ministry. The music blares and blows your ears out, you know. I mean, I love praise music. But it blows you out, and you got the thing for the women, you got the thing for the men, you got the, you know, take the kids through the Bible in 3 years, you know, we do this and that. But it is a segregated church, and by that I mean it looks like everybody that's there, a lot of them are just always on the inside of the church, and they're not on the outside. So I'm ministering to people on my street that are outside.
Okay, how do you do it? And specifically on this subject of empty nesters.
I don't know how to do it.
Well,
it says we're on. Tell me how to do it. I mean, I plant seeds. You know what I do? I do sprinklers. I do activities. I make the 8-year-old read when he doesn't want to read. He has to read the Bible in my house. He can't bring the cell phone in my house.
Okay.
You know,
wow.
And I go to the house, but I want you to tell me how to do it. I don't know how to do it. That's what I do.
You know, I can't. Wow. I think you should tell me how to do it. But you know, when we just relate this to the subject at hand, which is empty nesters, there's probably a couple things that you could do for empty nesters. And because we're talking with Michele at the end of the interview, and about how when the children are gone, you have maybe no one to love in your home, or not as many people. And so you have to reach out and love others. And there are always people. I mean, I think you could encourage the empty nesters, you know, to.
They don't have the Bible. They don't have it. They don't have it.
So that's the first thing, I guess.
Yeah. And so what do you do with the lost today in this modern world to give them the Word of God? I mean, how do you even start to do that?
Yeah, I think the way that I'm
How do you
comfortable
do it?
with is meet their need, and that gives you the opening. Because I think most people, as you really have indicated, it's hard to just begin a discussion about the Bible. But if you come into their life and meet a need that they have as a believer, or maybe they wonder why you were able to navigate this problem or that problem, those are openings to discuss the Word of God and Christ. I find those are natural ways.
Yeah, okay, exactly. So I send a pizza to the house, and I paid for it. And I do that. Then I go down there, and they go, oh, God, she's back again, you know. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I keep listening to you, Penna. I keep listening.
All right, keep listening. Andrea, thank you so much for your call. We appreciate it.
Thank you for taking it.
Let's go back to the phones. Let's see. Kathy is in Toledo, Ohio. Hi, Kathy.
Hi. How are you?
Fine. What's your comment?
I'm wondering if you could help me out with a dad that's having a problem with basically empty nest.
Your dad?
He's
or another dad?
No, my husband.
Oh.
My husband.
Anything specific? Anything specific?
My husband is ailing from ESRD, end-stage renal disease, and it's not getting any better. It's getting worse, and he's got a 30-plus-year-old son that lives clear out in Colorado, and another 30-year-old son who lives in the same area that we do, and my husband is getting upset because he really wants to be able to spend time with his kids and his grandkids. But I think ever since before him and I got together, he feels his son and his wife doesn't want my husband around.
Do you think his feelings are valid?
Well, sort of, kind of, I understand what he's saying, but I hear his daughter-in-law saying that, no, you're welcome to come over whenever you want. But, like, the one time they lived in a house, and my husband would go over to visit before him and I got together, and he had never even seen the inside of their house. He was not invited to come into the house.
Perhaps you could just do a special meal and invite them to your house. That way they could be the ones deciding.
We do Christmas, Thanksgiving, and then they'll invite us over for birthdays and what have you. But I'm like, my husband wants to have more time with his son and grandkids, and I need him to actually have a will to want to fight to stay alive.
Yes, and that would be part of that.
But I'm trying to figure out, how can I make my husband feel better about having the empty nest because his two sons have gotten married and moved on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's actually a good thing because they're getting on with their lives. That's what you want as a parent. You want your children to grow up and start families of their own. So he's still in the adjustment period, it sounds like.
I think he came to grips with the idea that he just didn't feel like he was welcome. But now he's with this, he's really, really feeling the sting of...
Oh, I'll bet he is. Well, all I can say is you're very important in his life right now. And I think perhaps opening your home on a more casual basis to have them come see him. Maybe he doesn't even feel like traveling as much as he once did. And also just being hospitable to the family and being part of that since you're newer in the family, I think would be one way. And certainly asking the Lord to give you wisdom and help. I'm sorry, but we're up on a break. But Kathy, thank you for calling and expressing that. It's a rough one, but I think with the help of the Lord, you can do it. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, yesterday I talked about a few pieces of legislation that might actually stem gun violence. There is another issue that also deserves attention. How many criminals and potential mass shooters are getting their guns through online gun sales? One report from a number of years ago suggested that this was a potential problem. That is why two members of Congress, Representative Elijah Cummings and Senator Elizabeth Warren, asked the GAO to investigate. In November, they completed their 2.5-year investigation. During the operation, undercover buyers revealed information during their transaction that indicated that they should not be allowed to purchase a firearm. That means they pretended to be felons or individuals with domestic violence or outstanding restraining orders or addicts or unlawful users of controlled substances or people who were dishonorably discharged from the military. Ultimately, there were 72 total purchase attempts that were made with these online vendors. How many of these purchases actually succeeded? The number would be 0. Most of the sellers, in 56 cases, refused to complete the transaction. In another 5, the cases were frozen. And in the remaining 11 cases, it seems that the sellers wanted to take their money without actually delivering the firearm. I might add that another part of the study looked into the dark web. Criminals and terrorists sometimes visit this dark place on the Internet where content has been intentionally concealed and special computer software is needed to access it. In that case, the GAO did complete 2 transactions, and both are referred for further investigation. For years, we've been hearing stories about the dangerous wild, wild web. It turns out that it may not be as much of a problem when it comes to gun sales. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Penna Dexter, and we've been sort of concentrating on kids and family today. And so one of the topics we're going to discuss is something that Point of View has focused on, I would say, since its founding back in the 80s and 90s. Our founder, Marlon Maddox, was very concerned about what goes on in the public schools, and we began to see over the years that the federal government would come up, and I think it would be the bureaucrats, perhaps in the Department of Education and others, with ways in which to make radical transformations in the curriculum of various states. And, of course, school curriculum is supposed to be controlled by your local school board and your state. But in many cases, there's always a grab by the federal government to influence it and to get control. And a lot of this comes from the left. I don't think most of our listeners are unaware of that. And there are all kinds of programs that have begun to, each one of them gets sort of a bad rap after a while as we begin to expose the problems with it, and so they come back. They sort of they reincarnate as something new with a different name. And so we're going to today discuss the latest in that sort of progression, and it's called something called social emotional learning. And my guest, Stella Morabito, she actually did a great talk at the Family Research Council recently about this. I wish I could have been there in the audience, but since I couldn't, I decided to get her on the radio so she could share her knowledge with all of you and with me. And let me just introduce our guest. Her name is Stella Morabito. She's a senior contributor at The Federalist. She's written for a lot of periodicals and publications, The Washington Examiner, Public Discourse, First Things, Weekly Standard, American Thinker. And before she was focusing on some of these issues of education and political correctness, she was an intelligence analyst. She spent nearly a decade in intelligence work. Then she was a stay-at-home mom raising her family. And then she came back, and now she builds public awareness of how political correctness and groupthink corrode human relationships. And she's begun researching some social emotional learning. It's really a new fad in the public schools, but there's really nothing new about it in some ways. It's supposed to shape the attitudes and feelings and behaviors of our children so they can excel, and teaching things like empathy. And, you know, that sounds okay, but there are some big problems with it. Stella, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Penna.
Well, it's good to have you, and I think I just got to ask you to, because I didn't do a great or complete job of defining social emotional learning, so would you do that for us just to start us off?
Sure. Well, I can just kind of give the background as I see it, and it's basically a new education fad that comes out of all the what they call the research on emotional intelligence and all of that, and of course, the past many decades of failures in the school system in terms of academics, they are now blaming on kids not being prepared emotionally and socially to learn. And so they've put together this program that is supposed to make it easier for students to learn by they have 5 points in it, you know, by developing all of these really great characteristics for parents to teach their children. You know, there's a certain amount of self-awareness, regulating your emotions, being socially aware, and, you know, developing good skills for relationships and making responsible decisions, which I think we'd all agree are great goals for parents to teach their own children. But they are writing this into a curriculum that they want to be part of Common Core. They want a mandate to teach it and put it in every school. And what you're left wondering when you look at not only the massive, monolithic, bureaucratic education establishment, asking them to be in charge of what are basically basically a parent's job, is you're also looking at all of their partners. CASEL, which is the name of this organization that's pushing social and emotional learning. They call themselves the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And they want a government mandate to teach it in every school. And so what could possibly go wrong, right? You just leave the bureaucrats to tell kids how to feel about everything, what to think about everything, defining what what kind of social, where they should fit in on a social, in the social strata of the schools, which is a whole other issue that, I think, the schools are not places for healthy socialization, in my opinion, these mega schools. But anyway, that's just kind of get you started on that.
Well, Stella, first of all, how are they doing in their goal to get all the schools on board?
Okay, I don't follow a lot of the statistics. There are people like Karen Ephraim, who's a pediatrician, and Jane Robbins, who have, put a lot of, study into all of the different, where it's moving in all the state legislatures and everything. My understanding is that it's been adopted by about 10 states and for K-12. And now I could be wrong about that. I should have looked that up to confirm it before I talked. But
that's okay. It sounds like it's in its infancy then.
Well, no, I wouldn't call it infancy because I think they've managed to get it in all kind of government-funded, federally funded pre-K programs. And in pre-K, I mean, that's where you can do a lot of the damage, and I think that's all in all 50 states. But but not so much in K-12, and people are starting to resist like they've started resisting Common Core. So while I wouldn't say it's in its infancy, it certainly isn't off the ground. They aren't home free with it.
Okay, and you say that it demands compliance. So once it's in, everybody has to comply, including all parents?
Well, the way they treat parents is kind of like if you look at their website, this group called CASEL, CASEL.org, and you look at their frequently asked questions. What can parents do to help their kids with their social and emotional progress and, growth and development? The answer that they give is just go to your school, your public school, and model what they tell you at home. I mean, that's the answer.
Wow.
Parents are basically sidelined to be cheerleaders for this bureaucratic program that teaches kids, how they should feel and what they should think and what they should believe and what their attitude should be. By the way, CASEL has a lot of partners that have agendas that they also want mandated universally.
Mm-hmm.
For example, one of their partners is called the 1440 Foundation, which pushes transcendental meditation in the schools. Another one is the Arcus Foundation, which is the whole homosexual and transgender agenda. And then you got the environmental stuff. I mean, there's just a whole host of
It's
partners.
really liberal causes.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Which, the way I would put it is, it's all about centralized power. They all of these causes they want universally, complied with. They want universal conformity with them.
Well, after the break, I want Stella to comment on this because think about this, over the break as you're just kind of contemplating this issue. But Stella, before she was a writer for the Federalist and before her kids and raising them, she was an intelligence. She worked in intelligence. She also has her degree in Russian and Soviet history from actually my alma mater, the University of Southern California. And she is describing to us this top-down, opinion-shaping, utopia-forming type of education that sounds like it actually could come out of the Soviet Union and what we know about them. And we do know that that type of influence has been in many trends that have worked their way into our educational system beginning back in the 60s, but intensifying in the 80s and the 90s when we had things like affective education, Goals 2000, school to work, careers, outcome-based education. I mean, in a sense, there's nothing new under the sun, and in a sense, there is always something new that keeps pushing its way in to our educational bureaucracy. I think that's what we're talking about, but I'll let Stella weigh in on my thoughts and theories. After the break, stay with us for more of Point of View. We'll be right back.
With the way things are going right now, there's got to be a source of truth somewhere.
Eric lives in California, and he's listened to Point of View since he was a child hanging around his dad's auto shop in Nevada. He says it's his only trustworthy source of information about what's happening in the world.
Well, I feel bad because I have not been donating, and I'll tell you what, I'm getting back to that because just recently I realized with all the junk going on with all the media, with all these news things, the only one that I count on is you guys, and what would I do if you guys weren't there? I don't know what I'd do. Where would I get my news? And I would be dead in water. So I got to do my part.
Make sure you do your part, like Eric. Join the Truth Team. Get all the details by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team. Support the truth and make a difference for the future. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Penna Dexter.
And I'm so grateful for my guest today, Stella Morabito. We are discussing a new phenomenon in education that's actually being implemented in states across the country. It's called social emotional learning. It really, in a sense, Stella, it seems like it involves making teachers mental health therapists and also getting access to the child's emotions, their opinions, and trying to sort of implement some kind of conformity there. And I mean, continue just describing this.
Yeah, it's if you read any of Karen Ephron, this is the pediatrician. She's published a couple of things in the Federalist on this issue, it's basically about allowing mental health screenings as well as so much else, and the big data. Putting all of this stuff into a database. I mean, part of what she's written about is pretty frightening.
What about their opinions? What if they're Christians and they believe, for instance, in traditional marriage, or they think homosexual behavior is not, right?
Well, I'm sure that they will be processed and programmed and conditioned. That's the goal, anyway, of the advocates of social and emotional learning, conditioned into what they believe would be the correct beliefs and attitudes and feelings to have. I mean, that's really what this is all set up to do, and of course to enforce conformity about all of that. And it's kind of ironic that they would talk about lessening anxiety in children when they're going to obviously reward what they would consider right think and punish what they would consider wrong think. By, through the kind of relational behaviors, peer modeling, and, the kids who get the social rewards are the ones who go with the program, and the kids who are going to get the social punishments, of course, are going to be those who don't agree. But one of the insidious pieces of all of this is what Karen Ephron has written about in terms of the mental health screenings that are being proposed, and also the data collection. I mean, there's something called digital learning where kids are actually hooked up to the computers to, answer all these really invasive questionnaires about their feelings and attitudes. And it all, in addition to, getting all the kids' answers, it also tracks their physiological responses, like, whether there's, sweat or a pulse rate, and things like that. I mean, very invasive, really totalitarian, really, when you get right down to it. And, we had talked you had mentioned that before the break, how, my Soviet and Russian history plays into this. And any kind of study of totalitarian systems will show you that trying to enforce conformity with with the power elites, preferred views on everything is nothing new in human history. So, this utopian urge to, build a really predictable world where everybody agrees with some power elite's idea of how things should be is, not new. And it always requires oppression of anybody who might not agree.
Well, Karen Ephron, you mentioned her articles, and I remember interviewing her many, many years ago about basically drugging children, diagnosing ADD, overdiagnosing it, and then, the tremendous, it became so rampant in the schools of pulling parents in and saying, we think your child has this, you need to give them this drug and all of that. And so this just seems like a part of it. The schools, it used to be the 3 R's back in my parents' day, reading, writing, arithmetic, but it's become so much more than that. And we have fought, those of us who've been paying attention, this this recording of data about their emotions and their opinions. And I remember back in the 90s when my kids were in school, there was a move to opt them out of a lot of the assessments and the testing because we felt that these tests, and it was hard to get a hold of tests, but when people did, they saw that much of the questioning on the tests was about your opinions, not about academic subjects. And so, we didn't want our children's opinions because a lot of us were Christians and we thought, this may be used against them at some point. Is that a valid fear?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, it's just gotten so much worse. And, trying to track kids by their, you had talked originally about, the ADD issue, and that's another story, but it's also about enforcing conformity. They get rid of recess to try to get the boys to settle down by claiming that they all have, so many of them have the attention deficit disorder, I mean, they complain about calling something a disorder. I mean, what they do to boys is incredible. I mean, it's really unfair. But yes, I mean, this puts kids into emotional straitjackets where, and is very invasive, and they will have, punitive experiences as a result of being pigeonholed if they let on. I mean, kids are, it's so important to them to have peer acceptance, and to be rejected is, for a teenager especially, but any child, is, it's a horrible experience. And what a program like this does, I believe, is heighten that, that possibility, and it's very anti-family. I mean, it's very intrusive into, how kids are brought up. I mean, if it doesn't accord with all of the agendas, the social agendas that they're being pushed, especially this whole transgender thing. I mean, that is just built for, just creating all kinds of confusion and identity issues in children, and fear of being rejected, and it's really bad.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I put an article that Stella wrote on the website at pointofview.net. It's something she wrote for the Federalist. And, when you look at this and see, okay, do we really have a lot of kids that need help with their emotional state and all of that? And we do, in a sense, because public schools are making them unstable in certain ways. And she's got an article, 13 Ways Public Schools Incubate Mental Instability in Kids. And it's just how the schools sometimes have to do, just for practical reasons, because the settings are sort of abnormal. They're not real life. They're huge a lot of times. And they foster and breed cliques. And they're also breeding grounds for aggression, a lot of reasons that, you might have problems when you're putting kids in that setting. So that's one piece of this, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, just, and especially as schools, I think in Matt, I also mentioned just the sheer size. I mean, back in 1929-30, there was something like 250,000 public schools in the United States. And if you look 80 years later, 2013, 14, it was 98,000. And during that time frame, the population tripled. So you can see the compacting, the packing of, thousands of kids. I mean, this most recent horror in Florida, that school, there was, I believe I read it was 3,300 students at that school. Mm-hmm. I mean, the sheer size, imagine being a 14-year-old, walking in, your freshman year, and then, being overwhelmed by not just the size of the place. I mean, it's just the bureaucracy of it is, it shrinks your sense of value as an individual to kind of be in a setting like that. That's so enormous. It's like institutionalizing you. But But then you're dealing with all of the relational aggression that happens through all the clicks, and then being labeled, and it's the schools of, like as you just said, Penna, they create the crisis, and then they don't want the crisis to go to waste, and they use that to make things worse. I mean, a lot of people who push this monolithic model, this factory model of schooling, are the same people who have pushed for policies that cause family breakdown. And
we're going to unpack that a little bit more, Stella, after the break. This is disturbing, to say the least. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. On the 2017 National Day of Prayer, President Trump took a remarkable step in support of religious liberty. President Trump assembled religious leaders from a variety of faith traditions in the Rose Garden of the White House. In addition to making remarks about the National Day of Prayer, the president signed an executive order strengthening religious liberty. The executive action prioritizes religious liberty within the Trump administration, encouraging the HHS secretary to consider rules alleviating the religious conscience of those impacted by Obamacare, while ordering the IRS to decline enforcement of the Johnson Amendment and directing the Attorney General to issue guidance to all executive agencies on the law governing religious liberty. This executive order is one of the ways in which the president is fulfilling his constitutional obligation to ensure that the laws passed by the legislature be faithfully executed. Moreover, the executive order reins in those administrative agencies that have, in recent years, often ignored the laws governing religious liberty. As my boss, Kelly Shackelford, said after the president signed the order, our country was founded on the promise that its government would respect the religious liberty of its people. America's commitment to freedom, and especially religious freedom, should be our national priority. Much work remains in defense of religious liberty, but with this order, the president has set his administration on good footing. To learn how First Liberty is protecting the religious liberty of all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Penna Dexter. My guest is Stella Morabito, and we're talking about social emotional learning, and it's really, in a sense, indoctrination and more than that. But Stella, so there's desired attitudes that the state and the schools would want students to have, ways of reacting to things. And a lot of them, it sounds like, are contra church and contra family. And so in order to move the students, they use peer pressure. And I'm sure some sort of remediation, too, correct?
Well, they have to. I mean, I'm sure they do. I mean, in this, in to make it work, yes, they do. And in fact, when you talk about peer pressure, I think that is definitely an inherent part of it. In fact, if you look at when I spoke to Family Research Council a couple weeks ago on this, my thesis is that this is a statist agenda, statist meaning, a government control agenda, whose effect, and I believe also intent, is the control and regulation of all personal relationships. And I know that sounds like kind of a, out there kind of thing to say, but the monolithic, the scope of the project and its ambitions lead us exactly there. And we're talking about, personal relationships are basically molded in large institutions like, schools by peer pressure. And I have if you've looked at my blog, it's dedicated to understanding that personal relationships are really the main source of power, because all knowledge, if you think about it, comes through the give and take we have in talking to others, reading what others have written, and, everything we take in. And so it's a very ambitious agenda, and they actually, the CASEL, the collaborative that pushes social and emotional learning, has a frequently asked question on their website where I believe that they actually agree with my premise, because the question is, why is it essential and, to life success and, school success of all children? And they go on, blah, 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 about, emotions and all that. But at the end, they say relationships are the engine of learning. And I absolutely agree with that. But what they want is that the keys to that engine of learning, all personal relationships, be given to a monolithic monopoly on learning. I mean, that's really what this is about. And that's what that does to human beings when you enforce conformity. I know I'm getting into the weeds here, but when you think about what that does, when you are put in a position where you have to conform, you can't really develop your own personality. And you see this in a lot of these kids, these teenagers, they take on personas. They haven't really developed their own unique personalities. They just kind of mirror what their peers have, shown to be acceptable. And so anyway, yes, I don't want to take up too much time answering that one question of yours, but that's right. The peer pressure plays an enormous role in pushing through this piece of social engineering that we call social and emotional learning.
So this may sound like kind of a dumb question or a basic question, but what happens to academics in all this?
Oh, yeah. No, they get sidelined. They come right out and they say, oh, it doesn't matter. Kids can just look up what they want to look up on the Internet. They don't need a teacher to tell them, anything about the Civil War, or, any of that. They can just look it up.
It almost sounds like they don't want us to know about history.
It sure does, doesn't it? And in fact, history and civics especially have not really been taught in any meaningful way in the public schools overall for decades. I mean, most kids are constitutionally illiterate. I mean, even on college campuses. I mean, they don't understand. They're not grateful for a system that allows them to think their own thoughts. And they've had their capacity to think basically disabled through this system. And that's what propaganda does, by the way. It's really built on the idea of replacing thoughtfulness and conversation with conditioned emotional reflexes. And I think that's really key. What we're seeing, you see it not just in, the latest round of the town hall and the shooting thing in Florida, but and how a lot of kids are so scripted on college campuses as well as high school kids. But what you're seeing, the snowflake effect that they call it, being really falling apart, not being able, getting all bent out of shape if you hear an opinion that's not the opinion you've been programmed to believe.
Wow.
what that is an emotional reflex that's been conditioned into them, programmed into them through years of just going through this system. I mean, in some kids, between if you add pre-K to K-12, 14 years in a system that doesn't really emphasize academics. I mean, think about young children. They're so curious about the world.
I know, and you're squelching that.
Absolutely. They're just, they come eager to learn, and then they just get bored out of their, in best case scenario, they're just bored, and they don't, absorb any of this other garbage. But, and that they can actually, in their spare time, whatever spare time the schools permit, because they really overload kids with so much, they can maybe, pursue their own learning. But, it's really, it's awful.
Well, Stella, I mean, we need to devote a whole program to answers for Christian parents, but, there's homeschooling and Christian schools and all of that. But I think right now, since you talked at Family Research Council, that's what spurred this for me. They're a public policy group. So is it too far gone, or as in Common Core and outcome-based education, a lot of these other things that have come along, there's at least been the ability to give that a stigma among traditional Americans to start the critique going. Has that started? Is that kind of a movement, a pushback started? And, how far along is it?
Well, I think a lot of people don't really understand that this is on the move.
So the education is the first part then?
Yeah, people need to understand what it is. And, and we're, like I spoke on it, and Karen Ephraim does, and Jane Robbins, and, but there needs to be more public awareness of what's going on. And then, yes, I mean, actually when you think about it, these utopian schemes, they're actually very fragile. That is why they require so much censorship. They require so much, they don't allow any other opinions, is because they are so fragile.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's something that we need to, take heart in, but also follow up on through education. And also,
you know what, I've got to jump in because the show is almost ending. And this just tells me we have to have you back. We also have to get Karen Ephraim on and start exposing this here on Point of View, and we will. And just thank you. Thank you for being brave and taking the wealth of experience you have and putting it out there to help people understand this. We really appreciate it. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Andrew, thank you. And also Steve, Karen, and Kirby will be back tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347